What's going on, everybody? Kalipus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Motorola Moto G Stylus 5G and going over whether or not it's still a good phone to buy in 2022. Now, this phone was released around the summer of 2021, so while it's not really that old, we're definitely getting closer and closer to the time where we should be getting a successor. And with the new Motorola phones starting to come out, like the Moto G Power 2022 for example, I figured now would be a good time to go over what kind of value this phone still provides in 2022. Now before we go any further, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It helps out the channel a lot. But with that being said, let's get started. Now this phone has a 6.8-inch IPS LCD display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 386, an aspect ratio of 20:9, and a screen to body ratio of about 85%. So this is definitely a real high quality display. Everything looks real nice, and the 1080p really makes a big difference. With phones like this, we're really starting to get into the mid-range, where you expect a 1080p display, but still some phones in this same price range only have 720p displays, especially since over time, now that it's been a little while since this phone was released, it's a lot less expensive than it initially was. So phones around the same price you can get this phone for do tend to have much lower quality displays. As you can see, the image is nice and sharp, and the colors look good. Now I just did a video on the Moto G Power 2022, and one thing I noticed is that phone, along with lots of others, despite having 720p displays, do have 90Hz refresh rates, and the Moto G Stylus 5G only has a 60Hz display. But it does make me wonder if the 2022 version of this phone, when it comes out, will end up having a 90Hz display. I personally would probably say yes. If the Power has it, I'm pretty sure at least the regular Stylus will, let alone the 5G version, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see. But overall, I would say this display really looks good. Another thing I really like about it is the size. At 6.8 inches, this display is a lot larger than your average smartphone, and it has a decently tall and narrow form factor, so it's going to be good for all kinds of content consumption, whether you're streaming videos, playing games, viewing photos, even reading. When you're reading stuff, you're going to be able to fit more on the screen since it's not only larger, but it does have a pretty tall form factor. And of course, when you're streaming videos, things are going to look nice and cinematic in landscape mode. So overall, if you're looking for a phone for content consumption, the Moto G Stylus 5G is definitely going to be a good option for that. Now for the front-facing camera, we got a hole punch up here. Looks real nice and clean. And this camera is 16 megapixels. Now for storage, this phone has 128 gigabytes of internal storage with microSD card expansion. So this is a good amount of storage, but keep in mind, there are other variants of this phone that have 256. In fact, I actually did have one at one point that was factory unlocked with 256 gigabytes. And when I repurchased this one, I did get the Cricket version, as you can see. And this specific version does have 128 gigabytes. But just be aware that if you get it factory unlocked, it will have 256, but there are other carrier versions that only have 128. Either way, you're going to be getting a real good amount of storage with this phone. And if you're a power user and you have lots of apps, photos and videos and that sort of thing, this phone is going to be a great option for that. Even if you're just an average user and you don't have a whole lot on your phone, with the system, apps, and data in general just getting larger and larger as time goes on, it's always a good idea to have extra storage. So even if you don't think you're going to use 128 gigabytes, having a phone with this much storage still doesn't hurt. Now this phone does not have wireless charging. For security options, we're getting both a fingerprint scanner right here on the back and face unlock as well. I always like when phones have both options because I know even some flagship phones like the iPhone 13 for example don't always have both options. So it's nice to have both a fingerprint scanner and face unlock just in case in certain situations one of them happens to be more convenient than the other. But with that being said, let's go ahead and give this fingerprint scanner a try and see how well it works. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, this fingerprint scanner is real fast and responsive. No issues here. Now taking a look at the rear camera setup, we got a quad camera here with a 48 megapixel main camera, an 8 megapixel ultra wide camera, a 5 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. Now if you want to see some actual photo samples from this phone, be sure to check out my full review of it on the channel. But I will say, this camera setup is really good, and if you're a frequent user of the camera, if you're taking lots of photos for social media or something like that, this phone will definitely get the job done. The pictures are really high quality, and overall, I would say the camera setup is pretty impressive. One thing I especially like about this phone is that it has an ultra-wide camera. Compared to some other phones in this price range, sure, lots of them do have ultra-wide cameras, but at the same time, a surprising amount of them don't, which I don't really get because ultra-wide cameras are so basic and common that I would think every mid-range phone would have one, but unfortunately that's not how it is, so I'm glad that this phone has one. Now for video, this phone can shoot in up to 1080p in the rear and front cameras, so no 4K unfortunately, and that is a little bit of a disappointment because the 4G version of this phone can actually shoot in 4K in the rear camera. So yeah, it's pretty unfortunate that this phone can't too, seeing that this phone as the 5G version should technically be better. But it is what it is. If you do want a phone that can shoot in 4K, there are definitely several phones in this price range that can. Now internally with this phone, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 480 5G processor. Now I ran a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on this phone, and it came back with a single core score of 504 and a multi-core score of 1660. Now it's kind of funny because I actually ran a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on the last version of this phone I had too, and the score was definitely lower than this. I don't remember off the top of my head what it was, but it wasn't quite as fast, but that just goes to show Geekbench 5 benchmark tests aren't really that meaningful unless you have something to compare it to. So I would suggest running a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on your current phone and comparing it to this to see if this phone would be an upgrade, because again, these pure numbers by themselves don't really mean a whole lot unless you have something to compare them to. But with that being said, through my experience with this phone so far, I will say that I haven't had any performance issues. It's definitely pretty fast for what it is, and you'll be able to do most things on it. In fact, I've even been testing some mobile games on this phone that are a little bit more high-end and graphics heavy, and they've been running surprisingly well so far. So overall, if you're going to be on your phone a decent amount, and you're going to be doing more moderate activities, this phone will definitely get the job done. Now I can't say it's going to have the performance of a flagship phone, because it's definitely not. This is no iPhone 13 or Samsung Galaxy S22. It's still very much a mid-range device, but with that being said, I will be posting a gaming test with this phone in the near future, so you can see how it handles some of the higher end games. Now if you're just doing more normal activities like sending text messages, making calls, browsing the web, going on social media, stuff like that, this phone is going to be pretty fast for that. Now for battery, this phone has a 5000 milliamp hour battery that supports 10 watt fast charging. So that's pretty impressive. With this phone, you're not only going to get great battery life throughout the day, but you're also going to get lots of longevity down the road, because as the battery degrades, which all of them do, the battery's not going to completely wear out nearly as soon as it would if it were smaller. So if you like to get one phone and keep it for a long period of time, then this phone is a good option for that. In addition to this, the fast charging really helps too. Even though it's only 10 watts, which is relatively small, especially for an Android phone, with the fast charging, you'll be able to charge it up, of course, a lot faster. Now this phone does not have NFC, which is one unfortunate thing about it that's becoming more and more of a disadvantage as time goes on, and more phones that are newer start coming out with NFC. In case you don't know what it is, NFC is the technology behind contactless mobile payment services like Google Pay. So with this phone, since it doesn't have NFC, you can't use Google Pay on it. Now I know a lot of you don't actually use that feature, so that's not going to be a huge deal for you. But if you do use that feature, definitely keep this in mind, because depending on how important it is to you, it could be a deal breaker. So now that we've gone over some of the specs of the phone, let's take a closer look at the device itself. On the left-hand side here, we got the slot for the SIM card and the microSD card. On the bottom, we got a 3.5mm headphone jack, a USB-C port, the microphone, and the speaker. And of course, can't forget about the stylus right here. On the right side, we got the power key and the volume keys. On the top, we got the noise-canceling microphone. On the back, we got our camera setup and our flash, the fingerprint scanner with a little Motorola logo, and the Cricket logo right down here. Now, of course, as this little logo suggests, keep in mind that this is the Cricket version of this phone, and for all intents and purposes, it's pretty much the same as any other version there is, but there is still going to be a few differences, like for example, the storage. The unlocked version does have a 256GB variant, but the Cricket version only has 128. So don't forget that while most things about this phone are the same across the board, there are some differences that do vary from carrier to carrier. Now honestly, I don't really know why this phone has a stylus. I guess it's really just a gimmick, because this stylus doesn't really work that well. I mean, it works, you can still do stuff with it, like if I wanted to draw or something like that. So if you wanted to give it to a kid to color with or something like that, yeah, it'll keep them entertained for a little while. But trust me, it really doesn't work that well. If you want to do any real type of art or anything like that, you're probably going to be pretty disappointed because the stylus, while it is kind of cool in some regards, it's really more of a for fun thing rather than being an actual tool you can seriously use. So in conclusion, is the Motorola Moto G Stylus 5G still worth buying in 2022? In general, I would say this phone is still worth buying, provided that you don't get it at its original full price. If I can remember right, I got the factory unlocked version of this phone for around $400, but I got this one from Cricket for around $130. Of course, the pricing and availability is going to be constantly changing, so if you do want to see what it's going for now, be sure to check the link in the video description because I will be updating that. But overall, this phone does provide a decent amount of value. It has a really nice display that's not only high quality, but it's also really large. Although again, I will say, a lot of phones that have been coming out recently are getting 90Hz displays, which is going to make the movement on the screen a little bit faster and smoother. So if that's a feature you want, then you might want to get a different phone from this one because of course this phone currently only has a 60Hz display. But the point is, if you want a 90Hz display that has a little bit more of a premium feel, then this phone might be a little disappointing. But other than that, the display is really good with the 1080p resolution, large size, and overall really good brightness. For content consumption, I really don't think you'll go wrong with it. Then of course, we got the storage. 128 gigabytes or 256 if you get the unlocked version is pretty impressive. So if you're a power user, if you have lots of apps and stuff like that, this is going to be a great option for you. And when it comes to budget phones like this, you're probably really not going to get any higher. So as far as storage goes, this is definitely among the best there is. As far as the camera setup goes, I really have no complaints about it. So in general, while there are a few features that newer phones are getting that this phone doesn't have, overall, I would say it's still a good phone to buy in 2022 as long as you get it for a reasonable price. Again, if you want to see info about pricing and availability, be sure to check out my link in the video description because that information is always changing. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video and I hope you found this information useful as well. If you did, don't forget to leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And as always, I will see you in the next video.